I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this OU Economic Seminar Series. This is the final seminar of this year's series, and I'm Susan Newman. I'm the Head of Economics here, and I'm really pleased to be chairing today's event, where we'll be discussing the concept of essential work. It's a particularly close topic to me, and I've worked both with Sara and Michal, our two speakers, here in different ways. So I'm really delighted to be hosting these two distinguished speakers, Sara Stevano, who's Senior Lecturer in Economics at SOAS, University of London, and Michal Nahman, who's Senior Lecturer at the University of the West of England. We will also be joined by some of the artists from the This is Essential Work online exhibition, which is an online open access intersectional feminist exhibition initiated by academic mothers and creators. So among the artists we have here are Anna Ream, Jess Baum, Helen Acklam, and Shweta Beast. So welcome. Before I move on to fully introduce our speakers, I'm just going to provide some housekeeping. As I mentioned already, this meeting is being recorded, and the recording of this event will be uploaded in due course on our website. For the Q&A, please do use both the chat function or raise your hand. And also to let you know a bit about the format of this series. So it's a bit different from other university economics series, possibly, because what we've tried to do is bring together academics to exchange, share and engage in dialogue with policymakers, practitioners, activists, industry representatives and members of the public, and now artists. We started this series to bring together diverse realms of expertise, all working on current challenges across a broad range of topics. And so please do have a look at our website, which I'll share in the chat later on, to see what to see what's coming up. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. So first, we've got Dr. Sara Stevano, who is a development and feminist political economist. She's a senior lecturer in economics at SOAS, University of London, after holding teaching and research positions at the University of the West of England, Bristol, and King's College London. Her areas of study are the political economy of work, food and nutrition, inequalities and social reproduction. Her work focuses on Africa, with primary research experience in Mozambique and Ghana. Sara is committed to expanding the boundaries of economic research and teaching through interdisciplinary approaches, qualitative methods and micro-macro bridges. Michal Nahman is Senior Lecturer in Health and Social Sciences at the University of the West of England. She is a social scientist who uses the theoretical and methodological tools of sociology, anthropology, feminist science studies to examine closely the political, social and cultural dimensions of biomedicine, reproduction as they relate to race, racism, nationalism and globalization. More recently, her work has examined gendered forms of work and colonial dimensions of global fertility chains. Michal Nahman, along with myself and Yuko Edwards, is one of the curators of the This is Essential Work online exhibition, and will share research and artwork into the question of essential work from feminist perspectives. So without further ado, I will hand over to our first speaker, Sara Stevano, who will present her research on the question of essential work. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Susan, not only for the lovely introduction, but also for having created this very unique space, I think. And I'm very pleased to be given the opportunity to be part of this conversation. In fact, it's probably also a little bit intimidating to speak in this context with not only academics, but artists, because I think academics very often are quite good at talking among themselves, but then we need to become a lot better in fostering dialogue with the wider communities where we live. So it is I hope that what I have to say will come across clearly. But if not, I'm very happy to address any clarification questions that people might have at the end. And what I want to say, I hope, is somehow very, it links well with what the art exhibition that you have organized, This is Essential Work, because the gist of what I would like to say in this presentation is that the notion of essential work does have a transformative potential, but to mobilize that transformative potential, it is essential to reach far beyond the boundaries of academia. And hopefully this is just one of the first spaces where we do so. So if you bear with me for a second, I would like to share my screen because I've prepared some slides. In my presentation today, I will draw on a paper that was published last year in the Canadian Journal of Development Studies, so part of a special issue on the COVID-19 pandemic. And this paper, which was entitled Essential for What, and as a question, and this is also what gives the title to this webinar today, was co-authored with Rosimina Ali and Meryl Jamieson. So I very much would like to acknowledge their work on this paper, because it was very much a collective effort. So before I tell you a little bit more about the paper itself, I want to share with you what the main argument that I would like to put forward is, and then I will just say a couple of words on what it means to take a social reproduction lens. And then I will share the key findings of the paper itself, and I will conclude with some emerging questions. So the main argument that I would like to make is the following. So clearly, there is a gap or even a tension between a feminist understanding of essential work, which in a broad sense is work that is needed in order to make life rather than profit, and how many governments across the world have used the notion of essential work, particularly during the first year of the pandemic. So for me, if we start from this perspective that there is such a gap or even a tension, there are at least a couple of questions that become quite salient at the moment. The first is whether it is desirable to reclaim the meanings of essential work from a feminist perspective. But then there is also another question, which is whether it's possible to do so, in particular with an aim to realign the social and economic value of work. And this is because I think one of the key lessons that we've learned from COVID is that clearly in our economies and societies, the social and economic value of work is certainly not well aligned. So in terms of the desirability of doing this, my answer is in the affirmative. So I would say that it is certainly desirable to try to reclaim the meanings of essential work. And perhaps a bit later, I want to say something as to why this is not, I mean, this looks like an obvious answer, but probably it's not. And in terms of the possibility to do so, I think that this is fundamentally a more political question. And whether it is possible or not depends on the ability of feminist movements across the board to foreground these demands. And for feminist movements to take a very prominent role in shaping economies and societies in the post-neoliberal world, if you want, or in the post-COVID world. So having shared this main argument with you, I would like to explain what it means from my perspective to take a social reproduction approach to the question of not only essential work, but and not only work in general, but also to think about the functioning of the economy more broadly. So very often in economics and political economy, as many people here will know, there is a focus on market activity or production. And to take a social reproduction lens means to essentially turn this on its head. And instead of starting with production, starting with what is needed in order for production to take place. But the key issue here is that taking a social reproduction lens does not only mean to look at social reproduction rather than production, but to understand the articulation between production and social reproduction, which indeed are not two separate domains, but to use the terminology or the phrasing by Cindy Katz, they are mutually constituted and in tension in contemporary capitalism. So on the one hand, we have capitalist production, and on the other hand, we have social reproduction, by which many social reproduction feminists, including myself, understand social reproduction in a very broad way, as to in that it encompasses all of the work, unpaid and paid, and also the material social practices that are needed to reproduce a human life, and also to reproduce a socially differentiated labor force, which in other words means to reproduce capitalist relations in a society. And so what is I think at the core of taking a social reproduction lens is to analyze how labor is allocated and divided across production and social reproduction, and also how it is valued or in fact often devalued, and that is particularly the case for social reproduction work. And indeed, this ranking in terms of value is at the root of the perpetuation of structural inequalities, which indeed were magnified during the COVID-19 pandemic. And from our perspective, the designation of workers as essential or non-essential during the COVID-19 pandemic was a very important dimension of the reorganization of work during the pandemic, where in fact the COVID-19 pandemic itself, I think, needs to be understood as being fundamentally a crisis of work, where we understand work in a feminist sense as including both productive and reproductive work. So moving to the motivations of our paper, Essential for What? The reasons why we started working on the notion of essential work around probably April 2020 was that it was very evident from the very beginning that what was being called essential work at that point, a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it was also what feminists would call social reproduction work. And it was also evident from the very beginning that essential workers are predominantly working class, Black and brown people, women, and migrants. And so governments engaged in this massive rebranding operation, if you want, where there was a sudden shift from the use of labels and categories to refer to work as low skill and low productivity jobs, for example. And they replaced these labels with essential work labels. So from my perspective at least, and probably not only because many feminists talked about that at the beginning of the pandemic, it was quite a significant shift. And therefore we were interested in trying to understand whether the notion of essential work had any potential or offered any potential to revalorize social reproduction work. And so we set out to address two key questions. The first is what is essential work and how have the classifications of essential work been used by governments in the first phase of the COVID-19 pandemic, so between January 2020 and June 2020. And the second question was how can the uses of essential work classifications be assessed from a feminist social reproduction perspective. So what we did was we compared the essential work classifications used in 7 different countries. These countries were Brazil, Canada, England, India, Italy, Mozambique, and South Africa. And then we developed an assessment of such uses, zooming in with specific illustrations from Mozambique, which is a country that both Rosimina, Ali, my co-author, and myself have been working on for a number of years. So our findings, I'm going to present our findings in 2 blocks. So the first part of our findings is very much based on analyzing the categories of essential work used in these 7 different countries. And we were actually quite surprised to find out that there were indeed some common categories across the 7 countries, but the common categories were only 13 out of 53 total categories that we found across these countries. So that meant that there were clearly many differences in terms of what was considered to be essential work across the countries that we looked at. And, for me at least, this was surprising because when governments started talking about essential work, there was something that I felt was quite intuitive about the notion of essential work, or the fact that for some forms of work had to continue while others could either work from home or stop performing their work during the pandemic. But in fact, what these classifications told us was quite a different story, right? Where how countries defined what constituted essential work or not was actually quite different. So just to give you some examples, England did not list cleaners explicitly as essential workers, while Brazil and Mozambique did not list carers as essential workers. Another example shows that some countries qualified quite specifically what constituted an essential good. And this is what, for example, South Africa did, while others left it probably intentionally quite ambiguous. And this is what happened in England, for example, which had very significant implications for what companies like Amazon, for example, could do. And in many contexts, it was clear that what ended up being on those lists of what was essential work was the outcome of very intense negotiations between the government, the employers, and the trade unions. And this was certainly the case in Italy, where in fact those lists were updated a number of times, reflecting the balance of power across these three main actors. So clearly this suggests that there is no intuitive universal meaning of what essential work is, but in fact the ways in which governments have used this concept was revealed the very political and fungible character of essential work. And so if we are to address that big question, essential for what, it is clear that the way that governments used that concept was not only about protecting health and ensuring the reproduction of human life to some extent, but it was also to protect some parts of capitalist production and capital accumulation. And in a way, this reflects also the nature of social reproduction in a capitalist society. But indeed, it is a fundamental tension that I think we need to bear in mind when we think about how we can reclaim the notion of essential work from a feminist perspective. Now, the second set of findings are about revealing some critical omissions or partial integrations in those classifications of essential work. And we identified three of such omissions or partial integrations in our paper. The first is that the one type of essential work that was clearly missing from all these lists was unpaid care work. And that was revealed by the fact that the importance of care relations across households were largely neglected through the stay-at-home policies that required everybody to stay at home. But also the expectation that paid work could continue regardless of the increased reproductive work taking place in households reveals that clearly unpaid care work was not considered to be essential by any government. The second omission or partial integration in this case is that of informal work. So this, of course, depends on context, but it went from cases where informal workers were essentially excluded from essential work classifications to contexts in which they were somehow included, but then having been designated as essential workers did not bear any material consequences for them. So it was rather inconsequential. And the third critical omission is that has to do with work integrated in transnational dynamics. And so this is primarily the case of supply chain workers in the global south, so those workers at the origins of global supply chains, but also migrant workers in many countries across the world. For whom exactly, so having been designated as essential worker or not, did not have much of an implication in terms of their ability to continue to perform their work, for example, because I can tell you, for example, in Mozambique, many workers who work in agri-food chains were by the classification set out by the Mozambican government considered to be essential. But of course, if their work in Mozambique was connected with a global supply chain that was disrupted in other places of the chain, then that meant that many of these workers could not work in the same way during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so these omissions or partial integrations reveal what we called a productivist Western and nationalist bias, which is embedded in the notions of essential work as used by governments during the first phase of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I think it's very clear why I started this presentation by saying that there is clearly a gap or even a tension between a feminist understanding of essential work and how governments use these notions. Now, if I were to write that paper today, I would probably place more emphasis on the double-edged nature of essential work, and I'll explain what I mean in a second. But I think that when we wrote the paper, we thought that broadly speaking, being classified as an essential worker was mostly a positive thing. And this is because because many essential workers, not all of them, were able to keep their job and income, which is, I think, a positive thing. But of course, what our paper highlighted was that not all essential workers were able to do that because of the triple bias that I've just described. But also what I think became very clear later on is that many essential workers were also much more exposed to the disease. And so now we have very clear epidemiological evidence that shows that excess mortality or COVID mortality was much higher among essential workers, and in particular, some categories of essential workers, such as healthcare workers, taxi drivers, and farm workers. And this is drawing on some studies on the UK and the US. But also the concentration in essential occupations was one important determinant of racial and ethnic disparities in COVID mortality in the US, for example. To this, I would also add that being classified as essential worker in some cases heightened the disposability of these workers. For example, through schemes that were put in place to recruit essential workers on demand, as it has been described for farm workers, for example, sort of transferred from countries in Eastern Europe to the UK or Germany in order to perform agricultural work when needed, without ensuring that that work could take place in safe and healthy conditions. And I think that this is important to think about the complex nature of essential work in the context of the pandemic. But so coming to the conclusion, what is the overall assessment of the notion of essential work and how the classifications have been used during the COVID-19 pandemic? So the key message is that essential work classifications have, I think, forced a global recognition of the social value of workers that who were normally considered to be low-skilled and low-value workers. But there are certain important limitations that we need to be very aware of. First, unless the biases that I have described that were embedded in the definitions of essential work are overcome, the most vulnerable workers will be cut out of any potential process of revalorization of essential work. Second, so far, there is no evidence, any systematic evidence, let's say, that any material gains or gain was made by essential workers. So, in other words, the misalignment between social and economic value of work continues to be not addressed. And in fact, I think it is currently being exacerbated in the context of the global living crisis that we are living through. And finally, there is possibly an emerging consensus that essential work designations have increased the disposability of many essential workers. I would like to conclude, however, with a second set of buts, which points to, why I started by saying that I think it is desirable to try to reclaim the meaning of essential work, and it might as well be possible. First, there is some anecdotal evidence that at least some categories of workers in specific contexts acquired visibility during the pandemic. By virtue of having been classified as essential, and that gave them more bargaining power, for example, vis-a-vis the state. And that was the case of informal food street vendors in South Africa. And this is evidence that has been collected by an organization called Viego, doing a lot of work on the informal economy across the world. Second, I do believe that the transformative potential of the concept is not entirely lost. And this is because, indeed, the shift from low skill work to essential work is a very significant one. And there is something that we should hold on to, I think. And finally, I think the feminist movements can shift the political terrain by foregrounding their own understanding of essential work and prioritizing demands for the socialization and revalorization of essential work. So on this note, hoping that I haven't taken too much time, I end my presentation, and I very much look forward to learning more about the art exhibition and what Michal has to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sara. That was a fantastic presentation. We're going to keep Q&A to the end, after all of our speakers have given their initial contributions. But if you're worried you're going to forget your question, feel free to stick it in the chat, and we'll collect them up that way. But I thought that was a really, really great ending, because I think Michal's going to pick up from that ending, particularly in terms of foregrounding concepts, understandings of essential work from a feminist perspective. So I'm going to hand over to Michal now.
Brilliant. Thank you, Susan. And thank you, Sara, as well, for that really kind of theoretically rigorous underpinning of this. So I'm going to talk to you very, very briefly about our upcoming exhibition, This is Essential Work. So I am coming at this as an anthropologist. I come from a medical and political anthropology background. And I also have an interest in visual social sciences. I've made a film, which I'll talk to you a bit about, which is about, again, the hiddenness of gendered forms of labor. And but I'll start by telling you about how this exhibition came about. Oh, that's brilliant. Susan's turned her screen around so I can see what's going on. Amazing. So let's just go to the next slide. So, right, so you've got here the web link for our exhibition, which is not up and running yet, and we are going to launch it this month. So, look out for that. But I will be showing you some images today from the exhibition. Okay, so how did this come about? I'll just tell you a little bit about that. Susan and I met at a party, I think about, did we say 7 or 8 years ago, when we were both very interested in breastfeeding and breast milk and processes of extraction of breast milk. I, of course, had a background of studying cross-border reproduction and extractive processes of getting eggs out of women's bodies and selling them in a privatized IVF industry across borders. So I was interested in borders and nationalism and essentially women's bodies as the kind of original central point of the creation of value. So, so initially we were interested in the idea of bodybuilders drinking breast milk and breast milk ice cream. So we were at this party and we ended up chatting about that. And and I think it was probably about 4 years later that we actually got funding from the University of the West of England Vice Chancellor's Award to conduct this research into the privatized markets of fertility, specifically milk markets in India, between India and Australia. And so we've published one paper from that so far. It's called Nurture Commodified, and the link for it is on the screen. So I'm just admitting a person here. So we were really interested in processes of reproduction and the value of women's bodily substances. I'm not going to talk to you too much about this article and the research, but basically we went to India, and with the incredible help of a colleague in India, we connected with different organizations and actors who were central to the privatized trade in breast milk. I'll just say a tiny bit about that. We've had a global market around women's breast milk for about 15 years in places like Brazil and the US. There is an already existing, long-standing market of extracting so-called excess milk from women's bodies and selling it at a highly marked up profit. In India, it's much newer. Only in the last few years has one company, Neolacta, opened up its business in Bengaluru, in India, and they're a really interesting case because they're actually a company that began as a dairy producing business in Australia. They've taken the knowledge of around pasteurization and the production of milk, and they've re-implanted, brought it back to India, and created quite high spec milk processing plant on the outskirts of the city, and also sourcing milk from women really across the country. And the women are told to think about their milk as being in excess. So the milk that you have, you've got too much milk, and so we're going to use that. And that milk is in fact sold at approximately $450 per liter online. So we began this exhibition with that in the backdrop, and we had very much intended, when we planned this research, to give cameras to the women that were taking the milk from their bodies and supplying it to this company, and getting them to lead the exhibition and having women's notions of women's own notions of what does it mean to create art around this process, to document this market, to be central to the exhibition. Then, of course, COVID-19 pandemic happened, actually just a month after we got back from India, and we were not able to have the exhibition be what we had initially thought it would be. So, so really, we took a pause. We took a pause, and I went on Instagram to sort of try and understand my renewed situation of being a mum at home, trying to run courses and various other programs at my university, as well as performing all sorts of forms of care. And I document that a little bit in my Ethnographer in Lockdown Instagram account, which I've shamelessly put up there little poem that I wrote about being an inessential worker. I should add that, you know, I am a singer-songwriter on the side. I'm quite a sort of performing arts. That's my kind of side hustle, is the performing arts that I've always done, and that's the artistic side that kind of influences my working around this exhibition. I had also made a documentary film called Atomized Mothers a few years ago, which was all about isolation and the politics of care and the hiddenness of women's labor, of parents' labor. And that was really a kind of attempt to interrupt the narratives around motherhood that tended in this country to center on white middle-class women. So a lot of the literature and the visualities that we were exposed to were all about white middle-class women. And so this informs the backdrop of our exhibition, which was an attempt to interrupt that narrative, to bring in women from across the career spectrum, I want to say, different stages of their career, globally situated people. So people from the global south especially was really, really important. And so once we got our heads together sort of a few months into the pandemic, and we realized, okay, we're not going to be able to do this exhibition in India. We have this amazing funding from the university. We need to do something with that. We began to plan This is Essential Work. So it's going to be, we're as I said, we're about to launch it at the end of this month, an online open access intersectional feminist exhibition. Our call for artists returned a phenomenal over 700 pieces of art from around the world. As Susan mentioned, on the jury are myself and Susan and an artist called Yuko Edwards, who you can find on Instagram at Yuko Edwards, and also her website, www.yukoedwards.com. And the invocation, as the artists who are here today will know, was what is the value of reproductive labor today, and how does it relate to other kinds of paid and unpaid work? And this resonates very strongly, I think, with what Sara said. I don't know how long I've been speaking. I'm just going to check the time here. We're good. So what I'm going to do now is, it's a treat for us all. I'm going to show us I'm going to show everyone a few images and one short video from the exhibition. And some of the, I might turn this around, and some of the artists are here today. Yeah, you can exactly do the next slide. So this piece is by Bea Mello, called Exaustão. Bea's based in Brazil. She graduated in architecture and urbanism from the Federal University of, I'm going to say it wrong, Pernambuco. And she's been working as a visual artist since 2011. Currently, she's been focusing on the threshold between the figurative and the abstract through bodily movements. And this was really, you know, such a powerful kind of image evoking both labor and what it does to the body. So I'll just take you through another couple of images. Yeah, let's click through to Daniela Torrente's Victoria's Shadow. Daniela Torrente was born in Sao Paulo in 1976. She lives and works there. She specialized in image and contemporary culture, has a BFA in visual arts from Santa Marcelina. Her research moves between her interest in constructions of female identity and the experience of being a descendant of Armenian refugees. So she uses photography as a basis, but also uses other forms of art like engraving, video, drawing, collage, and sculpture, expressing themes connected with belonging, memory, patterns of identity, the feminine, and everyday life. This is a piece by Virginia Pino, who was born in 1985 as a visual artist and photographer, a teacher and researcher with a master's in communication. She develops research on cinema and representations of the worlds of work, production and circulation of images, the relationship between memory and the construction of urban space. Here we see an image of her mother, the image she has named Sewing Machine. So we see the woman is the machine, and her mother began as a sewing machinist at the age of 10, I believe. And this is her much later in life. We're very fortunate to have some of the artists here. I'm not going to say much about this next piece. Perhaps Shweta will come in a minute. I'm just checking that we've moved to the next slide. Yes, great, thank you. This is a piece by Shweta Bist called A COVID Family Portrait. We can come back to it, Shweta, if you'd like, when you say a few words. We've got another piece here by Helen Acklam, who is also, we're very fortunate to have with us today, and the piece is called Strain. And Helen may or may not say a few words about that in a few minutes. I'm just going to check if we got Jess Baum with us as well, because I'm about to show her video. And I don't know if we should show it without her being present, but we may have no choice. Susan's just going to check. Okay. I think I'm going to show it anyway, and then we can let her know that we've screened it when she arrives to say a few words.
Yes, I'm sorry. Do you lot?
Yeah, I'm not going to say too much about that piece other than I think it's really powerful in its polyvocality and kind of evoking such a sort of universal experience. So that really brings me to the end of my little sharing around our exhibition. As I said, it's going to be launched hopefully at the end of this month. We're really nearing the end of a very long and exciting process, as I said, of whittling down over 700 pieces of art to just 20. And we're very, very fortunate to have some of the artists here. Oh, I'm remembering now that actually I was going to show a couple pieces more of some people who are actually here. We've got Anna Ream here, and I would like to show, who else have we got here, Susan? I've got, I'll just go to my Google. Here we go. Clarice Gonsalves is here as well, and this is the piece that we've chosen, Hypostatic. And you can have a look at that. And then somehow it's not letting me, oh, there we go. And this is the piece that we've chosen by Anna Ream, who is also here today. IVF Madonna from 2019. So I'll bring it back to you, Susan, to maybe bring artists in to share. Thank you very much for listening, everyone.
Sure, thanks so much, Michal, for that. And
Susan, you're on mute.
Sorry, we're sharing one microphone. Oh no, you can keep that one on. Sorry, please excuse me. Yeah. So excuse all the technical hiccups there. But yeah, we've got a fantastic group of artists who are here at the moment. Some of whom had been in touch to say they'd come and like to share a few words. So I'm just going to invite people in to say something, and also if there's any other artists who hadn't previously said they wanted to speak, feel free also to chip in a few sentences as well. So perhaps I'll begin in the order they came in the oh, I should put, yeah. Let me start with Shweta.
And also just to say, obviously, the ones that are here, I didn't introduce you or give a bio because, I'm leaving it to you. So please introduce yourselves and say a bit about yourself to those here.
Shweta, would you like to start, kick us off?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Shweta Best. I'm a photographer, currently living and working in New York City. I was born in New Delhi, India, and relocated with my family to the US in 2013. My work is an exploration of maternal subjectivity, in particular the psychological experience of owning the maternal identity, the emotional labor of mothering, and how it is transformed over time as the needs of our children change. So when I was making this image, it had been over a year since the lockdown in New York. By this time, we had gotten into a sort of routine with homeschooling and, my husband's work and my own. I had started working on this project, the series from which this image is from. But there was a sense of hopelessness about the pandemic, not knowing when it's going to end and when things would go back to normal. And so I'm thinking about that, and also the fact that I was burdened with a lot of work. And funnily enough, this image came about a few months after my realization of how awful things were going, in a sense. It's like when you're thrown into the water, you're trying hard to stay alive, and it's only later that when you have a moment to think that you're able to bring it all back and realize what you have gone through. So I think this picture is quite universal. I thought this was an experience that I definitely would share with a lot of people. I was hoping that it did strike a chord with many other mothers and carers like me. Yeah, so in effect that it is. And I just wanted to comment quickly, if I may, about something Sara said. And as she was speaking, I was nodding my head here, that this whole idea of care work, not being considered economically productive, the one that is unpaid, is something that I have always had an issue with. I was a stay-at-home mother for a very long time, and this is one of the reasons that I made the entire series in my home, and I still make a lot of images in my home to kind of subvert that idea and the thinking that unpaid work, that that care work is not economically valuable. So I think that I'm really happy to be here and a part of this group and the exhibition. So thank you so much. This aligns very beautifully with my work, and yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Shweta. Honestly, when we first saw this picture, I think we all felt a pang of familiarity, although you all look much more beautiful and tidy than any of us could have done at the time.
Make a camera. I know how to do this.
It's wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to ask now if, let me just see if I can get this working. I was going to ask if Helen could come through. Yeah, if Helen, would you like to come and say a few words?
Okay, thank you very much for having me. It's yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you. So this piece called Strain is from a project I've been working on since the beginning of the pandemic, really, where I returned to an area in South Wales that I grew up in, and in particular to a place and an event which I hadn't really looked at, and which was surrounded in shame. And it had to do with events in my sort of teenage years. And so that's my sort of space of making the work. And I'm using soil from a particular ground and this place in the Welsh Valleys. And with that soil, I've been making pigments and making clay. And part of that process has been to strain the soil through various sieves, and in this case, a piece of muslin, in order to make the clay. This is a still, but there was a video of this work sort of dripping through until actually the weight of the soil and the liquid broke the fabric and it collapsed. So I was looking for that sort of tipping point. But I suppose as you've been talking, I've been thinking about sort of feminist work that I do and what I read about, and in particular around the sort of work of Julia Kristeva, and the idea of woman as abject, and how things are made abject by ourselves, but also by society. And once something is made abject and pushed to the back of the mind, or it's easier to be pushed to the back of the mind, it's easy to ignore, and it's easier to not come into sort of have a conscience about it. So I sort of think with street people, for example, how easy it is, or it can be, just to walk past people because we've somehow made them abject. And because of events which happened to me, I believe that I was, particularly at that time, it was sort of in the 80s in South Wales, and it was very easy to be silenced and made abject. And I guess as I'm listening to, you talking about the essential labour, how easy it is to think, to not really think about certain areas as labour, as contributing, to put them out of, to ignore, I suppose. How often do we think about the people who clean or who attend to in caring situations and as carers? So that's really made me think quite a lot about that, how this is sort of compartmentalized in the mind. And yeah, so this is an ongoing project for me. And I suppose this represents like the weight of something and the shape of something. So whether this is, the weight of labor, or whether it's the weight of guilt, or the weight of shame, or whatever it is for each one of us, it was making this sort of unseen, ignored, visible. So yeah, that's this work for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helen, and thank you for sharing that your thoughts and your work with us. I'm going to move next to Jess, but then after that, I'm going to call Anna, Clarice, and Yara in that order in case you wanted to say anything as well. So let me begin with Jess. I'm just trying to move on to.
Hello.
Hi, Jess. We can hear you well.
Hi. Great. You can hear. Did you say you can hear me
yes,
well?
Yes, we can.
Oh, good.
So remind us
Thank you.
as well. So that
Well, I've signed in very late. I apologise because I've been. It's ironic. I've been teaching ceramics to a bunch of kids. I'm a trainee art therapist, and a potter and an artist and a mother, and I apologise for being late, and I'm missing a lot, but it's lovely to be here and I'm very excited, and it's wonderful to hear Shweta and Helen, you talking about your work. And I've just been with a 9-year-old boy who's just been talking about his mother not working, and how she spends all of his dad's money. And so it's great to then come in to be here to kind of, because it's still a big problem, and hearing children talking about their own mothers being not essential in some way, it's really, I found that very problematic actually just now. I wasn't quite sure where to place myself, but like Shweta, the film I made was made during lockdown. I felt desperate and to connect with other people, and like Helen as well. I think that idea of being a pressurized container somehow under strain. This feeling of kind of something bubbling, not quite knowing what to do with oneself, and I kind of just put it out there to other people, and for some reason chose mothers, because I suppose I am a mother, and wanted to know if it was something that this idea of being a kind of boiling pot or a simmering pot. Some people didn't feel simmering at all, or boiling at all. If they'd like to make work with me, and it's the first time I've kind of worked in that way, and chose Medea, the music, because of her, that story as well, kind of being pushed to the edge as a mother. And it's interesting, again, Shweta, I make lots of work at home. Practically speaking, it's been, it's always been really helpful, but actually it's a really creative place. I've always found, for me, the home. And I can't remember, maybe one of you knows, but somebody wrote, some art critic or somebody some time ago wrote that the pushchair in the hallway was kind of the ruin of artists. Maybe someone can remind me who said that, but I always, my pushchair can stay in the hallway, thank you very much, and I'll make work in it or around it. So there you go. But thanks, it's lovely to be here.
Thanks so much, Jess. Yes, I don't know if you saw that we did show your film, I think just as you were talking, so we did all get a chance to see it. Thank you.
Thanks, Susan.
Thanks so much. I noticed we have a few other artists. We're finishing in 25 minutes. I do want to open up for more a discussion around both the presentation Sara made and as well as the art, but I realise that there are a number of other artists here as well. I mentioned Anna, Clarice and Yara, and I see also Marianne is here. Would any of you like to just say a few brief words about yourselves and your and what the thought behind the work that you submitted. Anna, would you like to say something?
Unmute myself. Sure, I'd be happy to. I am a conceptual and documentary portrait photographer, and I'm based in the United States in Issaquah, Washington, which is near Seattle. My work centers on identity, both individual identity and social identity. And the image that you have chosen, which one, I am so grateful to be included in this, and really grateful that you have to be a part of this and to see more about your own work and how it fits in, how my work fits into that context. The image is from a series that I have created called Madonnahood, which is using visual imagery, the visual language of Madonna art to symbolize how motherhood is idealized. And then I have taken experiences and realities of modern motherhood that I feel contradict those, that idealization. And this particular image is a friend of mine, and the IVF needles are actually needles from her IVF cycle that I turned into a crown and then took a portrait of her with them. And that gives you a summary. And I'll keep it brief and end it there so that you can include all the other artists too.
Thank you. No, we found it extremely powerful when we saw this image, as well as the other images as well. So I think we've got also Clarice, Yara and Marianne. I wonder if any of you would like to say a couple of words before we move on to a broader discussion. Hi, Clarice.
Yeah, hi, sure. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm quite nervous, so I wrote some words, like really briefly, about the artwork. I'm a visual artist and single mother. I live and work in Taguatinga, Brasília, Brazil. I have a BA in visual arts from the University of Brasília. And since 2005, I've been presenting my pictorial research in individual and collective shows, art fairs, and awards through the country and abroad. My production addresses themes such as socialization, sexuality, motherhood, animality, and their respective performances within the social contexts as a reflection of my poetic research around bodily experiences. My main medium of materialization is painting, although increasingly the performative processes have been part of the creation of these images in painting through dance, video, and photography. I'm a member of the Matriz Collective, an art collective formed by mother artists from Distrito Federal in Brazil that develops urban interventions in the city. And about this artwork, hypostatic. This term means to consider as substance or real thing what is just an abstraction or a fiction. I'll tell you a little about this artwork. In my artwork titles, I like to open to sensorial readings to the image, more than just bringing a literal explanation. And in this case, it's kind of like a joke, because care work, reproductive work, sustaining life management, domestic labor are not recognized or valued in our society. Even thought every living human being was birthed, nurtured, and kept alive until adulthood, mostly by women. I live in a colonial, classicist, and racist society. In my country, it's common for upper-class people to pay lower-class women to take care of their kids and their home, mostly Black poor women, and mostly they are very mistreated with no labor rights or childcare for their own kids. So the colonial imagery is still very present and very recent. I had in my family history as a daughter of a white woman from a middle-class family. My mother was raised mostly by housekeepers in a culture mirrored in the United States culture. My grandma, that has already passed away, bought the propaganda. I'm not going to quote the corporation responsible for that, but I know you can relate to what it is. At the time, that used to encourage women to not breastfeed their children for aesthetical reasons, and also the excuse that breast milk was weak. So my mother and her brother were not breastfed by my grandma. They were fed with powdered milk and stuff. Due to that, my mother has very fragile tooth, and all her life I remember seeing her metallic smile and always spending a lot of time with money and time with dentists. But I also remember that my mother once told me she, for a brief time, had taken milk from a wet nurse, a black woman. So I got this narrative with me for a long time. And when I became a mother, I could not breastfeed my own baby due to a malformation, a very profound cleft lip. So I spent months obsessed with milking, trying all the pumps that were available in the market and pumping milk for hours a day, every day, very few quantity, with the hope that after this first surgery I could still breastfeed him, but I couldn't. I was getting psychologically depressed and losing hair and slimming, so after 5 months I gave up. So this teen breastfeed was something very moving to me, and then I had the urge to produce this image that bring all those stories and the form of cure, but also mirror many other similar stories and oppressions around the globe. I was very happy to know that this image and its content could represent much more and be a place to bring discussion and visibility for such a taboo in our society. Thank you very much for the selection and congratulations to all organizers and participants.
Thank you very much, Clarice, for your very moving words and to know much more depth into what came behind that image. Thank you very much. I am conscious of time. I would like to open the floor up, but I would also like to prioritise any of the other artists here who might want to say a few words about their piece. Yeah, Marianne? Yeah, sorry, Marianne.
Okay. Hello, hi, I'm Marianne from Brazil. Thank you for having me too. I'm a single mother too. And there are these themes that are very important to me, like feminism and motherhood and being a single mother, but I never knew how to put this in my art. I'm a painter and I paint. I always painted more decorative things and still I was painting still lives from observation, but things like flowers and objects from home and things like that. And then during the pandemics, I had to stay at home with my daughter, and the schools were closed for nearly 2 years here in Brazil. So, but this was from 2020. It's kind of the beginning. Well, it was the worst part because the schools were closed and I couldn't even, well, let my daughter with my mother because my mother was also scared of the virus and everything. So I was at home alone with her like for a very long time and just cooking and doing the housework and all these things. And then I was painting a lot too, but I was painting the things that were around me, like in my home. And then I ended up painting this, which was a bit different from what I used to do because I used to do things that were more colorful and happy. And then I realized that it had an impact. A lot of people commented on this when I posted it on Instagram. And so I realized that, well, I don't know, I managed to put something that was going on with me in the painting, and it was good because from then I started to paint. I kind of found that I managed to find how to put a little bit of what I want to say in my art. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Marianne. We were very moved by that piece. Just, you know, the number of, just the amount that was behind this very simple image. You know, we could really feel, I think, much of that exhaustion work and like that was, you know, so silent and absent from that, but really very much at the heart of this completely, you know, undetected, unrecognized, exhausting work of social reproduction that we do. Thank you. I just want to give a final chance for any other one else of the artists who might want to say something. I know that Yara is there. If you would like to say anything, Yara.
Hi, nice to meet you. Yes, I'd like to say a few words. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Yara Vigiero. I'm a visual artist and also art educator. I have a diploma degree at Beaux-Arts de Paris, but I'm Brazilian. So for me, you were talking about the house. For me, it's my workplace, and it's a paradox between because as a mother, as a single mother, it's a place it has a huge paradox between the work, like being like I have to feed my daughter, I have to cook, and I have to clean the house. But it's also a place of joy. Like I really like to raise my daughter and to do a lot of things with her. It's also the place I create. It's the place I paint. So my work has not been shown here, but it's basically a short video, like a very naive frame of a daily play between a mother and a daughter, where you can only see my hands playing as a spider. It's called aranha, spider in Portuguese. And you can see my daughter's face reacting and joining the performance. It's actually her expression, her reaction that can make believe the spider. And that's the magic about it. So it's a very light frame of the home place. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Yara. We're sorry
That was my last shot of saying something. I'm a bit shy, but thank you.
No, well, we really appreciate you saying something, and apologies for not showing the film. We hadn't prepared it in advance, but as Michal's put in the chat, it will be available soon on the website. And we were I really enjoyed that film. And as you say, the look on your child's face and the paternal work gone into entertaining this child in the way that you do. So we do have about 15 minutes, and if people don't mind, we can probably leave that a little bit later. We could probably continue a little bit longer than that, but I wondered if anyone had any questions or contributions they wanted to make, both of reflection of like Sara's initial presentation.
I would like just to ask something,
sure.
Because I got a little bit late. This research, it was you started this research before the pandemic. Okay.
Sorry, yeah.
Because when Michal was speaking about isolation, I thought that I felt isolated way before the pandemic as a mother, and before I became a single mother. I guess the house for women is a place, for mothers is a place where we can feel very isolated. Yeah, continue, sorry.
No, yeah, Michal, do you want to say something?
Reduction of the welfare state, support services for people doing parenting was made in 2015. So yeah, way before that kind of thinking around isolation that I think a lot of us have been doing. Yeah.
Great, lovely. So can I open the floor up to any? I wonder if Sara wanted to say anything as well as people gather their thoughts for questions. Please raise your hands or put them in the chat box. But Sara, did you want to come back and say anything, having seen the artwork?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm really impressed with everything that I've seen, and I think that this is exactly what we need in order to reclaim the meanings of essential work. So it's very impressive. Like, I found it all very interesting, and it was great to hear all of the artists who spoke about themselves and their work. So I would like to say perhaps a couple of things. One is, I think for me, one cross-cutting message is, the complexity of social reproduction work in the home and in other places. And in a way, it is this paradox that social reproduction work is absolutely essential, but always made invisible. But also, particularly when we think about the social reproduction work that takes place in the home, that is also essential and necessary, but at the same time insufficient. And I think that this is, that feeling of exhaustion, the tipping point, and the crisis of social reproduction that emerges from many of the art pieces that I've seen is exactly about that. And it connects with with the question that Yara was posing to you just now, that in a way, the COVID-19 pandemic did not create anything new from this perspective. So all of these vulnerabilities and inequalities were there before. And what we saw during the pandemic is just an exacerbation of all of this. That is very clear from my perspective, and I think is something that comes across what others have represented in their art and said as well. Yeah.
Do we have anything else come on? Sveta, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on top of that is what I think is that, because I grew up in a very patriarchal home with, the structures were quite defined. And so what happens in a situation of crises, like what we faced with the pandemic, is you kind of go back and set back into what you know and the way you consider things and your roles in your family, because I had worked so hard to kind of drag myself out of this, the box that I was in when I was solely home with the kids. And it was a big effort to pull myself out of that situation and, restructure my life. But when the pandemic happened, of course, without question, I went right back into old patterns. So I thought that was very interesting, is, like how we are raised and what we see in societally, what is acceptable. You kind of reset to that kind of situation when you're in a sort of crisis, which makes it kind of, whitewashes the efforts that had gone into, the progress that was made before. I don't know if that makes any sense, but yeah.
No, absolutely, Sweta. I think that's something that comes up in history over and over again. If we look at, just like the suffragettes movement and the First World War, the changes that happened around those. But I actually have a question for everybody, but particularly to Sara and Michal as well, but anyone can come in if they want. Is just that, what should we do about this, right? Because on the one, there are feminist economists that worked out there that said, well, one way, and Sara used the word valorize this work, how do we imbue this stuff with value in a meaningful way? Because one way is to account for these within national accounts, so in a way, marketizing this as a way of imbuing value, but we know that happens in a way that devalues women's work. So I think my question to Sara and Michal, but also to others they want to ask, is like, what do we do about this? How do we imbue value in a way that does not lead to the devaluing of this kind of social reproductive work, not only by women, but majority by women?
Michal, do you want? I'm happy to go first, and then is it okay? Yeah. So yeah, I mean, that is, I think, a very fundamental question. Thanks, Susan. So what I think is necessary is not only the revalorization of this work, but also its socialization. I think the two things cannot happen in isolation. And so the socialization part has to do with the recognition that nuclear families or single mothers or whatever takes place within the walls of a house is insufficient, as I was saying earlier, in order to meet the needs, the social reproduction needs, and reproduce a human life, right? So there needs to be a different organization of social reproduction work in society, where we see the participation not only of the state but also, the community in taking care, in taking up social reproduction work. And I think that goes hand in hand with the revalorization of this type of work. But yeah, absolutely. So the point is, it cannot be only about putting a price tag onto this work, because in many ways this has already happened. And instead of having unpaid forms of social reproduction work, we have underpaid forms of social reproduction work. So this is what needs to happen, right? And I think that the only way that is possible is if we rethink very radically the entire economic system. It cannot be just something that is done through, some reforms when it comes to social policy, for example. So it needs to be a system an economic system that puts the, sustenance of human life first, and that is about social provisioning, and not about, profit making and the efficiency of market production, so to speak. And I know what I'm saying, this is very big, but I think that this is exactly what is needed. Like we need to be very radical in our demands. So yeah, I'm going to leave it there.
Great. Sorry, I was just smiling as Michal's daughter walked behind her there. But Michal, do you want to?
I'm not going to really be
anything?
able to sort of top that. I agree with everything that Sara said, really, and just to say that, in the immediate sense, how do we remedy with that? Well, I very much agree. Got a little person walking behind me. I very much agree that that just paying us to do this labor is not really the way to go, and that it has to involve, major change in the immediate sense, having better public transportation, having everyone having access to clean water and to services like education, a really meaningful, decent education and health. We're talking about, a really strong form of social reproduction. And I agree that involves a radical reorganization of society, because under the current way in which things are structured around profit, it doesn't really have the kind of appropriate, the appropriate needs in mind. So if we're thinking about accumulation, if a society is kind of structured around accumulation rather than nurture and care, so everything needs to be turned on its head. And that's why I think these messages of artists and feminist academics and other people, activists out on the street, we need all of these things together to create that change.
Thanks for that, Michal. I wanted to open to the floor in case anyone had any additions. Just an observation, I've noted that we've got people in this meeting from Brazil, the UK, the United States, and Uzbekistan, actually. Someone's here from Uzbekistan at the moment. So at least, so it's wonderful, this international dimension as well. Did anyone want to add anything? Any questions, comments? It's a very beautiful, unusually beautiful afternoon here in the UK, so many people are probably desperate to get to the sunshine. Sara, did you want to come in?
Yes, just a question I would like to ask you to say again when the art exhibition will be fully available, and to give us all of those details again. Yeah.
Yes, we're literally in the very final stages of arranging the website and writing the final bits, and we hope to release it in the next couple of weeks, really. And then the hope is that in the autumn we might be able to have a kind of launch of the exhibition, an in-person launch of the exhibition. We probably won't have the funds to fly over all the artists. That would be so amazing. But but we lack those resources. But we hope to have a kind of public launch in the autumn, but we are going to launch the actual online exhibition at the end of this month, which is very, very soon. And when I say that, it scares me a little bit because that's a few days from now.
Also to add that, you know, and I think it's very clear here, that this exhibition isn't the end of things. This is also about the network that we've created. And many, you know, everyone here is an activist, as well as a scholar, as well as an artist, as well as a mother, and all of this. And I think we should connect, we need to connect this as much as possible and see what impact we can make through these exchanges, these kinds of ideas, how they help in terms of organising on the ground, how we can move towards the kind of radical configuration Sara's, you know, outlined already. I think, you know, we want to see this. It's not just a nice dialogue between artists and academics, but really it's supposed to be a constructive dialogue where we can start working together and make a real impact in changing this for the better. So yeah, so anything you do, any artists do, anything you sort of go on to develop, you know, please, you know, we're very, you know, let's invite each other to as much as possible to get engaged as much as we can, not only in this conversation, but also in constructive action as well. So that's what I want to say on that. Clarice asked a question about whether a recording is going to be available later. So what we usually do with these recordings, Clarice, because the Open University where we are, I'm going to do a bit of a plug for the Open University where I am based now. You know, we have a mandate and an ethos of fully comprehensive higher education. So one of the things we do with this, with Christina Ascaridis, who organises, who's in the audience at the moment, is we develop open source learning materials out of this. So we may come to you and say, how would you feel about us including this in this open source? So that's usually edited and available online. In terms of the whole recording, I need to ask Christina, could we make it available to some people, Christina? Would it be possible? Because we don't normally share the full recording, but we might be able to make it available to those who would like to revisit this conversation. Let me investigate and get back to everybody. Okay, great. So we're at 6:31 British summertime, which is 1 minute after our closing. So everyone's kept an amazing time. I'm amazed that we've had such a rich conversation in such a short time. But no, that was absolutely excellent. Yeah, we're having some nice comments from our economics colleagues in the department as well here. And Jean-Claude wanted to persuade her son and other men to engage as well. An interesting challenge. So I don't know if anyone wants to reflect on that provocation before we end, the challenge of getting men to engage too in these conversations and discussions. Michal, would you like to comment on that? Perhaps that's a conversation we need to leave for another day, but a really important thing. But my view is we do it first, John Quill. We get on and do it first. Okay, right. I'm rambling now. So just wanted to say thank you. Thanks so much, everybody. It's been a really long day, and I'm really pleased that this has happened, and I'm extremely pleased that so many of the artists have joined us in this conversation today. And we really look forward to showing your work and engaging further, and we'll be in touch. So thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.